All right. The Tech Leads podcast. I think we're on episode 4 or 5 already. Everyone, I'd really like to extend a warm welcome to Darlene Wilson. Darlene, thanks for joining today.
Thanks for having me, Bob. Super excited about this and
Yeah,
excited to be able to spend the time with you.
yeah, should be great. Really looking forward to it. We've been talking about this for a while, so I'm glad we got some time together. Full disclosure, you and I are friends. We worked together at Software One for a couple of years.
Yep.
Did a lot of really, I would say, really good, valuable stuff there. Learned a lot from you. Uh, and
Likewise.
yeah, so why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, a little bit about your background, and then we'll dive right into the subject today is really going to be because I think we collaborated a lot on sales and sales enablement,
Yeah.
how to really kind of raise the bar for let's call it enterprise level sales, and we're gonna talk about our journey through our careers and how we kind of learn some of the tactics that we're going to talk about today. So with that in mind, why don't you just give us a brief background, talk about yourself a little bit, and then we'll just jump right in.
Great. Sounds fantastic. And without boring everybody through going through the entire resume, as you mentioned, we did work together at Software One. So I was at Software One, heading up our application services service line for the Americas for about a year and a half, which is where you and I had the opportunity to work together. Did some other work there in the area of looking at how do we build up our sales capabilities and how do we expand and grow pipeline in that space, particularly in the services space, which is entirely different from selling licensing. And then a lot of that experience came from my time at AWS, where I was prior for about 4.5 years in professional services, selling largely into, and I say selling, I should air quote that because I really found like what I was doing was more solutioning for customers and then having a commercial negotiation over what the costs were going to be. But I was there focused largely on enterprise customers, Fortune 100, Fortune 500 customers in the Central Texas region, and then spent about the last year and a half building up a business in the central US region focused on ISVs and digitally native businesses, which were entirely different. We can talk a little bit about that later as well. But the theme throughout my career, prior to that, I was with Whole Foods Market, leading a team of cloud platform engineers in the digital technology space. And the theme for me has always been throughout my career technology. So I won't go back any further than that, but because I think that helps bring it forward. And as you mentioned, we're going to talk a bit about sales today. Throughout my career, I've either helped support the sales team until I went into sales and held my own target and quoted directly at AWS, which was hugely intimidating for me. So, but a massive learning experience. So I'm happy to be able to talk about it today. So thanks,
Great.
Bob.
Same. I had similar experiences at IBM. So let's dive in, and just to kind of warm things up. I was thinking about this discussion for the last couple days, and I was thinking about my career in sales and some of the crazy stuff I've done. And the one story that I wanted to start with to kind of just go back and enjoy the memories, and then some of the things I learned from that experience is when I was at NC State in Raleigh, and I won't age myself too far, but it was before the first number of the year was a two. It was I took a job at doing door to door sales, and we sold coupons for a local Goodyear service station, kind of, right? So they were a mechanic
Interesting.
shop. They sold tires. It was a $15 coupon, and for $15 you got all these services, the chassis lube, and you got your a vehicle inspection, and you got an oil change. So that was the kind of kicker, right? For $15 you get all this extra stuff, plus you get an oil change with this coupon. And we would jump into a van in some place in Raleigh, and then we would go out into the netherworld of North Carolina, into these rural areas, these neighborhoods. We would get dropped off, and then we would get picked up again in like 5 hours, right? So no phones, right? This is this is back before I didn't
This is
know where
sounding dangerous.
I didn't know where I was. And it was dark after a while, obviously.
Yeah.
And yeah, we would just be walking around at night and knocking on people's doors. And like you said, you never knew what you were going to get. But there was a couple things through that exercise that I kind of remember And I still think to this day there's some value to, what those lessons were. And one of the things that we always did is we never grabbed like a full pack of coupons, right? You always grabbed a pack that had a couple already ripped off. So you had
Ah,
they
yeah.
were like stapled on the side.
Yeah, yeah,
So you
yeah.
could see that there was some missing already.
Yes.
And then we would take a rubber band on the end and we would stuff a bunch of cash and checks in the
Yep.
rubber band. And every sale we did through the day, we would put the money in the rubber band. So the new customer that you're going to
Right.
sees all of their neighbors that they have already purchased the coupon, right?
Right,
So
right.
so you have a check from, Mr. and Mrs. Jones from three houses down,
Yep.
and the guy you're talking to, and sort of like, the Joneses bought one, huh? So it was that connection that you would make with people to say, there's confidence here, right?
Right.
I'm not the only sucker that's going to give this 18-year-old college kid $15 for a coupon that I'll probably never use. And it worked really well. I did, not only because I think I got $5 for every coupon I sold, but then they had all these other things where you get like food. You know, there was like a local buffet where you could kind of go in and it's all you can eat for $5, whatever. So they give out tickets if you got past a certain number, you'd get all
Yeah.
these extra bonus types of things. So I basically lived off of that job for a good year while in college and learned a lot. So that was kind of my first experience in sales. And the more I think about it, the more I was like, yeah, that it's the whole confidence game, right? If people
Yeah.
see that other people are buying from you, it's almost like that the reference.
Yeah.
It really gives you a leg up. So we talked a little bit about some of your early experiences
Yeah.
before we jumped on. So I was going to let you talk about some of
Sure.
the stuff you did up in Canada.
Sure. And before I do that, I want to say one of the interesting things, the thing that came to mind when you said that was you establish credibility without even saying anything, just
Yes.
by letting them visually see something. That's actually really it's a brilliant brilliant strategy, brilliant approach.
Yeah.
So anyway, but offline, I'd like to hear more about whose idea it was because that was great. That's a great idea. So anyway. Um, so my background and experience, my first experience, and as we were talking about before we got started, was um, so I'm originally from Canada. I live in the U.S., but I've been in the U.S. I think longer now than I was in Canada. So again, like you, I probably will date myself. I was, living in Canada back when the dinosaurs roamed the earth at some point. But there's a very well-known brand that's still in existence today that was actually two Americans who started it, and it was a store called Roots and a brand called Roots. And I worked there through high school. And it was a really interesting time to be there because Roots is largely founded on selling, leather products. And they were established, they established themselves out of Toronto, Canada, through selling shoes, bags, things like that, and all sorts of really wonderfully made leather products. During the time I was working there, I think I was 16, 17 years old. There was a real craze. Everybody wanted a Roots t-shirt or a Roots sweatshirt. So when we opened the store for the first time I grew up in Winnipeg in Manitoba in Canada. And when we opened the store, there was a lineup around like down the mall waiting for us to open. And I mean, it was like that for days. We just had lines of people coming in to buy t-shirts. So you think, well, that's not a very difficult sales, approach because you basically got your customers out the door. All they're looking for is what size. The thing about that is they really wanted us to sell the leather goods and the leather products because that's really where the money was. I mean, nobody was complaining about all the t-shirts flying off the shelves. But they often had contests that they would run for us, on weekends, on weekdays, things like that, on who could sell the most leather products. And like you, and what they did for you, they gave us bonuses and things like that. In fact, I still have a leather backpack that I won for selling the most shoes on a Saturday.
Nice.
And I mean, it speaks to the back quality of the backpack that it's still functioning after all these years. But the amazing thing for me was, and the thing that I really learned about that was, here you have a very expensive product, which for me, at 16 years old, for somebody to come in and spend hundreds of dollars on a backpack or, even, somewhere between $100 and $200 or something like that on shoes and boots was a lot of money. And so the idea of really connecting with somebody and helping them understand the value of what the Roots products were, and why it was different from buying at any other shoe store down the mall, or some cheap bag elsewhere, or something like that, was really important. And so that for me was, I think, the beginning of helping customers, and helping me understand the idea of selling value and positioning value instead of the product or the brand. I mean, the brand carried a lot of weight, no question about it, and that carried through a little bit later to my years at AWS. There's a good brand there, but you still have to convince somebody to part with a significant amount of money.
Yep.
So it was a great learning experience, and I enjoyed it. It's a lot of fun.
Yes, I was just thinking what we would both give for a line of customers going down the street for our
Yeah.
services when we were in
Uh,
that business, right? It was,
wouldn't that have been great? I know. Yeah.
yes, yeah, it would have made life a lot easier for sure. Because that's part of the challenge that I think we both addressed when we were in those roles is,
Yeah.
how do you step up the game? It's a very competitive space. It's really tough to distinguish yourself, and it's really kind of a different game at the enterprise level, right? You really
Right.
gotta, we talked about, before we jumped on, this concept of the trusted advisor, and really being able to develop, a stronger relationship with your customer than just, and you use the word which I really liked, just the vendor, right? And being more of a partner. So tell me about where, I'm guessing it was sometime at AWS, but where did you kind of start to, take your game like to the next level, would you say?
It was at AWS, and when I joined AWS, I had not previously held a quota, or had any sort of sales target. As I said, I supported sales teams in previous roles, things like that. But I'd never actually been responsible for meeting my own quota, my own target, things like that. And so when I joined AWS, and they told me what my target was at first, I mean, I think my eyes were probably as big as saucers, and I was petrified because I thought, oh my gosh, like, am I going to be able to do this? And so I had a lot of concern about this. And what I found was, it was a fairly sizable target in the millions, that sort of thing. And what I found was, when I first started doing the first few deals, and started working with the account managers, because I'd actually partnered a lot with the account managers. Just to clarify, we were sort of, professional services was a little bit of an add-on service, for example, in the sense that we worked as part of a matrix team, supporting our clients and our customers at AWS. But what was really interesting about it was, I started with a number of small deals, and in the hundreds of thousands, which at the time to me again seemed like a lot of money. But then I started adding up how many of those deals I would need to do in any given year to meet my quota or my target, and it was a little daunting. And so what I started to recognize and realize was, for example, I was selling things, but not necessarily meeting the customers. There wasn't any follow through on it, in the sense that, for example, the easiest way to describe it, and, for some of your listeners who may or may not understand, but when you're working in the cloud and you're establishing a landing zone to create the foundation of your accounts, I could sell landing zones until the cows came home. The challenge was there was nothing in it. So what you wanted was the landing zone, but what you really wanted was something to be running in it, because that's really where, the revenue was met. Now, establishing that foundation is a great start. But again, so I started to discover that there really wasn't a lot of value in just positioning that, because it was like, great, then what? And so I started to look a little bit beyond what our clients were trying to do, and started to understand, or just purely from a technical perspective, and looked at, how do I actually meet them in the business side of things? Like, what are their projects they're working on? What are some of their goals they're looking at? And once I started kind of working on that, and broadening the horizon and the scope beyond just, I just need a landing zone to run my applications, or to run my, data infrastructure, things like that, and started broadening that and going beyond just that core competency and that core capability, things started changing. But that took a lot for me, and it took a few things, a few opportunities for me to actually get to that point and start to, the light bulb started to come on. Even though, I should preface, we were always told about, outcome-based selling and value-based selling. I could still sell an outcome for a landing zone, but it wasn't quite as compelling as an outcome for, and here's your entire application portfolio library that can be running on that. So anyway,
Yeah.
it was literally a light bulb moment for me. At some point, it came on early on in my first year, thankfully, and I went, "Oh, I think I understand this." So I don't know, but it was a great experience when that happened.
Yeah, I had similar experience at IBM, and it
Yeah,
was, the same type of thing where I finally, it was this, and I see it a lot today too when I work with sales teams and people who are kind of going through this, and I would call it more like activity based selling, right? How many people
yeah,
did you contact today? How many
yes,
calls did you make? All right. And not to say that it's not good to go and document your interactions and make sure the CRM is up to date and all those things, because they benefit the organization in the long run. But the idea of driving your team through the matrix of KPIs and measuring them based on how many calls they're making versus how many actual deals are closing or the size of those deals,
right,
I think gets a lot of people really, distracted from what's really important. And then, for me, I realized that at IBM as well, is that I can't make my number by doing 100 just platform level sales of,
yep,
one or two node networks, right?
yep,
You have to go find value in the organization, and the only way you do that is, it comes back to the checks and the cash on under the rubber band, right? You got to
yep,
have you got to have that credibility to be able to say, let's look at this more from a business perspective and say, where are you guys positioned competitively? Where are you trying to go into new markets, and how can we as a company and as a cloud provider help you get there faster and more efficiently,
yes,
right? And I think that's kind of the same thing. The light went on for me there. It's like you got to really step up the game, and then for me it became like, who do I need to talk to, right? And I
right,
got really good at recognizing, I'm talking to some engineer, not that the director of infrastructure isn't an important cog in the wheel, that they are, but I realized, I gotta get at a different level, right?
yes,
In the organization to where the decisions are being made, and you can kind of see the people who are under pressure to perform and to make adjustments in the business. And that's for me the kind of thing I was
yep,
like, all right, so I started going and saying, all right, who in the organization do I really want to target? And that's where I would go and try to develop the relationship. And then I would use that director of engineering or the director of infrastructure to go establish that relationship with that guy, right?
yep.
Let's get him out to dinner. Let's go figure out what he's doing, or what makes his clock tick a little bit. And that's kind of where it started really opening up opportunities for me.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And just two thoughts on that. I was thinking about my going back into the dinosaur ages when I was selling at Roots. The analogy to it would be it's great to, somebody could come in the door and I could show them the t-shirt that they, absolutely wanted. But at the same time, it could have been a college student, for example, or, and say, oh, you're a college student. Oh, don't you have to go? Are you carrying books? Things like I'm using it's probably fairly lame, but to get them interested in going and talking about things that would really actually add value more than just a t-shirt on their back sort of thing. And let's go talk about the leather briefcase, not briefcases, but the leather carrying cases and things like that that are going to last for a long time and be a good investment. And that's the same sort of thing. Is how do you open that door? The other thing I was thinking about was and always comes to mind is, and you touched on this a little bit, is know your back in, I guess, after I graduated from college, I worked at a brokerage firm for about a year and a half, supporting a few retail brokers. And in as part of any onboarding through any, if you've got any investment advisor you're working with, particularly in Canada, there's something called a know your client form, and you have to go through and figure and fill out all the details on your client, risk aversion, what their goals are, investment wise, things like that. It's the same thing. It's understanding your customer and know your client. It may not be the list of the questions may be slightly different, but to your point, having an understanding of what they're trying to do and where they're trying to go is going to help you resonate with them in terms of how you can add value with your specific product instead of just here, I've got a widget to sell you. You know, it's actually, do you need a widget? What kind of widget do you need? So you can get a little bit more into, oh, what's the value the widget's going to bring? Is, oh, this widget can help you with this particular product. And it's connecting with them on their level instead of connecting with them on your level. I don't know if that
Yes.
makes sense. Yes.
Yeah, I think that's it, right?
Yeah.
It's like let's I see it all the time. It's like let's get to the demo, right?
Right.
Like
Yeah. Yeah.
we haven't even had the conversation yet to figure out
Yeah.
why you're interested in the tool and what it is about the tool that's going to alter the course of your business or it's going to have an impact, right?
Right.
And it's that person that you're selling to. The other thing that I kind of learned is, I can make this guy into a hero or, he's going to be the villain, right?
Yeah.
And if he's going to go spend a couple $1 million with us and it doesn't work out, right? And it doesn't address the needs of the business, he's toast. I'm not going to be able to sell to him anymore. He's never going to call
Right.
me again, right? He's probably not going to last in this role for very long. So it kind of started flipping that thought process for me. It's like, how do I make this guy successful on top of, getting the sale, getting the product? So it's just became more, and then, I would sit and fret because the delivery would go south or something, but you
Yeah.
know,
Yeah.
but I had that in my head. It's
Never
like
happens.
I got to make sure that this is the right fit for this guy, so that he gets up to the next level, and then he's going to bring me back in for the next deal, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I kind of
And
learned
there's,
that thought process as well.
I completely agree. And one of the other, I don't know, sometime in the last 10 years, I read, and well, actually I had the opportunity by accident to go and see Simon Sinek speak or Sinek. And, and he was, at the time he had published the book, Start with Why. Start with why. Why is this customer or client of yours going to benefit from what it is you have to offer them? Why? And if you start there, as opposed to, this product can be all things to all people. No, focus in on why does this particular customer or client and everything. I love that idea. It resonates with me so well in this sort of space. Is start with why. Why is it that they need this?
Yeah, that's a
You
great
know.
point.
So
So
anyway.
I was gonna no, it's because you just gave me another great memory. I was selling to a customer in Chicago. It was Walgreens,
Yeah.
and the product. I knew the problem that the product I was selling, what it addressed, and it was another thing that I've really learned from, it just made me better at the next time I had an interaction. And the thing that it's one of the things I've always been good at, and everyone hates this, because it's like everyone doesn't have this skill, but I encourage everyone to go and practice it and to focus on it, especially when you're in customer meetings, especially if you're in person. And that is, I've always been really good at remembering people's names. So,
Yes.
and one of the things that I was always really diligent about in meetings when we were kind of going through introductions, and I always took advantage of like getting there a little bit early and then developing a rapport with the people who kind of came
Yep.
in the room before the meeting got going. And I would pick out the people in the room that I knew were having the problems that my product focused on, right? And
Yeah.
as I told the story of the product, I would build them into the story, right?
Right.
So
Right.
I would say Rajesh is the system administrator, right? I know that he's taking, he's not getting out of here until 9:30 Friday night because he's setting up all the backups because it's all manual. He's got to make
Right.
sure that they're going to get done correctly. And he's sitting there going, yeah, that's exactly, my life sucks because of, the way we have to do all this
Yep.
now. Are you telling me that I can get out of here at 4:30 and, get through my 2 hours of traffic and be
Yep.
home and have, dinner with my family on the weekends? That's like, yes, Rajesh, that's exactly what I'm telling you. This is what you're going to get from it, right? But I would build them into the whole proposal of what this product does, who are the people that are sitting in the room that are kind of getting grinded through the ringer here, and then I would tie them into the what that solution space was going to look like. So another really key thing is learn how even if you have to take notes while you're introducing people and who's doing what, Do your
Yes.
best, like to remember people's names and then bring them back up through the conversation,
Yes.
and you really develop that good, strong relationship.
I completely and wholeheartedly agree. But it's also about finding the balance because sometimes have you ever been on a call where somebody's repeatedly using your name over and over again and you're going, okay, now this is a little bit disingenuous.
Yes.
So anyway, but it's usually people who are, cold calling and things like that who are doing that where they continually, but I agree with you. It's finding that balance. Just don't overdo it. But you touched on something that I actually think is so incredibly important too. And you mentioned the idea of creating a story around it. And this is such a key and important factor is the art of storytelling as part of sales is so underestimated and and underutilized, and it is so key, and it's how do you connect and create that story, because people aren't going to remember the 10 facts you gave them about whatever it is you're looking at trying to sell them. They will remember the impact that you shared with them, like you said with Rajesh about, okay, you're going to be able to go home at night and, spend the weekend with your family and not be working online and all of that. That's what they're going to remember. They're not necessarily going to remember all the technical details. And that was a great thing. Just to, not, it's not a plug for Simon Sinek, but, certainly to go back to that. He talked about that. He talked about that in his book as, the idea that, Sony, Samsung, I think some of the other players had bigger, hardware manufacturers had MP3 players long before Apple did, or significantly before. Apple came out and said, here's what you can do with it. They didn't talk about it was 5 MB or something. They didn't even talk about how many songs you could store or anything. They showed what you could do. You could be dancing, you could be running. They kind of said, oh, here's what you can do with it. Whereas everybody else was just promoting the technical specs. And that's, kind of a key thing. And the second thought on that is, there's a great book as well that I recently read, and it was written by one of the writers at Pixar, and who produced fantastic movies, great stories. And it was a book called The Art of Hollywood Storytelling for Business, something to that effect.
Hmm.
And he wrote this book around trying to educate people in business on how to tell a story and how to create a good story, for your product, your service, whatever that is. And that's such a key and important aspect of it, and which is exactly what you were doing, which was I'm creating a story. It's a little story, but it's based on what I've learned about the key people in the room. And so I love that, so you can create those little stories or the bigger stories. But and I think for me, going back to the time of when it changed for me, that's when I started to realize, oh, there's a story behind this. And here's what you're going to be able to do, and here's the impact it's going to have instead of, I remember we used to have all these decks that would have, entire teams. It was the how. It wasn't the why. It was here's what the team structure is going to look like. Here's what the project plan is going to look like. Here's all of the details. But nobody really understood that or was going to remember that. But they were going to remember, oh, we were going to lower your costs. We were going to increase your automation. We were going to reduce, defects being produced. We're going to improve security. And that's the piece that they always remembered. So it's about the story, which I think
Yeah.
is so key. And I love that you raised that. That's cool.
Yeah, that because the other thing that I started to realize is, and you kind of pulled this out when we were at Software One a little bit too, and I started using it more and more, because one of the things that I think you instilled in the sales process, Software One, which I took a lot of value from, was this idea of research, right? And really being prepared, knowing where your customer was in the competitive space, knowing what they were doing from a innovation perspective, and just going and finding as much information as you can about them and what's going on with that company before you walk in the door. And then, putting yourself out there a little bit and having an idea of what's the art of the possible, right? And we kind of
Right.
talked about that a little bit as well. And here's the way I always like to frame it is here's what we see other customers in your space kind of doing. But the other thing that I started taking away from that whole research idea is I would just kind of go and say, just looking at some outside data, looks like your overall budget, you're an insurance broker, right, or some type of healthcare company, and more than 60% of your budget is being spent on IT, right?
Yeah.
your healthcare company. Why are you spending so much of your budget doing IT stuff? What if, what? And the way I would phrase it is, what would you be doing with that money
Yes.
if it was only half, right? If where would you be going? And then you kind of see like people sit back, and it would almost start like arguments in the room, like, yeah, Jim, what would we be doing? And I would kind of get them going a little bit, like,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
we would be doing a lot
Yeah.
of stuff, Bob, right? We'd probably
Yeah.
be, we'd probably doing more sales. We'd probably have, be able to hire some more people, higher skills. And you kind of start getting them going, like thinking of
Yes.
what their world would be like if certain things changed, right? And that's kind of where I would pull back a little bit and say, I think there's a roadmap, a path to get you
Yes.
there, right? To where
Yeah.
you start freeing up these resources who are spending all this time doing all this manual stuff, trying to keep the ship afloat. How about if you outsource some of that, you automate a lot of it, and then you start to free up that part of the organization to go do more and innovative things.
Exactly. Yeah. No, and I love that. And it's so true because if you come in with ideas, look, every business, we can overcomplicate things. And as society, we tend to do that, and particularly in the technology space. But even from a business perspective, it's really simple. Every business is trying to solve one or two problems, probably both. How to improve the top line and increase revenue, and how to improve the bottom line, and increase and improve overall efficiencies. Everything they do is either going to be pulling one of those levers or both at the same time. So, I think I love the example you used and going in and say, what would you do differently? The idea of doing that research is that you're coming to the customer with some ideas, but you're doing it with humility. You're doing it saying, hey, and also it goes back to, I think, even to your initial, your initial sales story of stuffing the money and then the checks, which I love, is nobody has to understand the sausage making that went into it. But if you come in and say other businesses in the industry are doing this, you're now establishing credibility. And so you've done your homework and you've basically said, okay, we're going to come in. Here's what we're seeing other, businesses in your industry doing. Here's a little bit about what's happening in your industry. And then tie it back to the top line or bottom line. You don't have to call it out that way, but that's exactly what you're doing, and come to say, these are some ideas. And again, observations. It comes back to, I've divorced 5-6 years ago and had or maybe it was longer. I don't know. Anyway, so I went back to, I always like to use this as an analogy. I went back to dating, and recently got remarried. So I'm excited about that. But at the time, what I really learned and understood, and this is the human connection, which is a little bit of the storytelling. Everybody wants to talk about themselves. And so, that's the thing, is everybody wants to impress upon you something about themselves. And so if you walk into a room with a little bit of research, or even a lot, it doesn't have to be complicated, but just some ideas that say, hey, took the time to understand you. I've come with some suggestions, with some ideas. You then open the floodgate for them to ultimately talk about themselves, and giving them some talking points rather than just coming to the table and saying, tell me your 5 pain points. I mean, that's the most boring, thing ever. But it is how you begin to become, what we've talked about is a trusted advisor. And that's really where you can start to see the magic happen. And it gets anyone in the room, like you observed, talking amongst themselves. And you can kind of sit back because you can just watch the dynamics and understand, and you learn more about a business just by doing that than even having to pull out with questions. So you come and present ideas and then let them have the conversation. So that for me was transformational when I started to discover that. And just,
I
come
saw
in.
it happen too. I
Yeah.
saw you kind of get the room going, right?
Yep.
And it's not all of a sudden it's not your pitch anymore. It's the
No.
customer kind of sharing a little bit of the dirty laundry, and then saying, kind of looking across the room and saying, "Can you help us with that?"
Yes. Yeah.
And that's where it's like, "Oh yeah, we can," right? I'll
Yeah.
also caution that I've seen it go the other way, right? Where the customer basically, gets protective and saying, "You don't know our business.
Yeah.
Who are you to come in and tell us what to do?" And I had it happen to one of my team members you know, in the short past, and the customer was a little bit put off
Yep.
because they came at it from, these are my ideas, right? And
Right.
here's what I would do if I were in charge.
Yeah.
And I coached them to say, that it should be more about, that whole, this is what we're seeing other customers do,
Yeah.
right? So, don't get caught in the trap of, I'm the innovator, I could help your company take the next leap, right? You should hire me.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And really, kind of put it in the context of, this is our business, this is what we do, and this is what we see other people doing who have similar challenges, and this is how those engagements worked out, right? So this is what the
Yeah.
benefits were back to the business, and this is how, we're still working with them and still helping them progress this, but they now have like faith that there's a road, a light at the end of the tunnel, right? And
Right.
this is not going to be the 10-year project that takes $50 million out of the company.
Right.
It actually is something that you can digest, and because I think that in our business that was always the big challenge is we just have these monstrous problems where you'd walk in and we would say, what's the state of your applications? Do you have any that need to be modernized? And they would always go, oh, like, yeah, what doesn't
On
need
them.
to be modernized?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's like, we got stuff from, the 90s sitting back on
Yeah.
servers in the data center. It's too
Yeah.
overwhelming, right? It's like,
Yes.
we don't have the time, we don't have the budget. And
Yeah.
that's kind of where I get my finger on the pulse a little bit and say, there's a way, right? There's a way
Yes.
for us to kind of do it. And you can
Yeah.
digest it in small bites, and you can do it in a way that's cost effective, but giving them that, the hope, right?
Right. It's so true. And there's a couple of things that you just, jog my memory on a little bit. One, you go back to the storytelling, right? It's how you tell the story. And the idea of identifying that research and going in with that research isn't necessarily just about the research. It's how you deliver it. And that's a huge, so there's so much nuance to it. And, the idea of first and foremost, like you said, go in with humility. I mean, go in with humility. Look, here's what we're seeing. We don't profess to be, experts in your business. We're just coming to you with some ideas based on, what we're seeing other companies in your line of, your particular industry, with some of the similar challenges. We're just bringing them to the table to have a discussion so that we can come up with some comprehensive plan and a roadmap that works for you. So just ideas, and I did notice, I think when, I did observe, and I've observed in over time, people get right into like trying to recommend products. Like, here's how you should change your mobile app. That's not what we're saying at all. We're kind of looking at the bigger business decisions, like, what you're doing from an IT, service management perspective, or what you're doing from a cloud implementation perspective, or, DevOps, things like that. Very broad umbrellas, not down into your mobile app should be doing this, things like that. It really, because that's where you find that people get a little bit, territorial about that is one way. And so that's just one thought is the nuance of that. The other thought on that too is, now I lost my train of thought, so I'm gonna have to put my hand up.
All right, take a break.
It was a good one. It was a good one.
Good water.
Yeah, what was it? So we did the, time to value. That's what it is. Okay.
All right.
So, so the second thought on that, beyond just the nuance of how to deliver it is, and I love that you raised this, like in terms of a roadmap, and being able to for customers that you're working on larger type engagements that might run over multiple years, there's studies that talk about, specifically for just using the analogy of the cloud, 70 to 80% of customers running in the cloud aren't happy with where they're at because it's taking too long. But the other aspect of it is the time to value in some of these efforts is too long. And so if you show a customer a 3-year roadmap, which is great because you're now starting to build out something that you can work on together for the next 3 years, but that customer is going to have to go back to their CFO every year and secure budget for it. So even, you're going to want to make sure that you can demonstrate in anything you're doing to your customer the time to value in incremental short things and show them where you can show that return on investment. Because if it looks like it's going to be 3 years, most customers are just going to go, way too long. So what are we going to do in this first year? So what are we going to do in the second year? There's going to be three things. Stagger things out so you can kind of show that you can meet those needs. And it's not suggesting that you want to create things that out of nothing and that aren't going to be of value between, just to prove that. But certainly if you can demonstrate that, rather than just having like one big line on a Gantt chart that runs 3 years, that just, that's where you start to get people just their eyes glazing over. So
Yeah, exactly. Like you'll be able to fix this in the next eon, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And
Just wait. And every year you can go back to your CFO and ask for more money, and nothing will be done yet, but just keep waiting.
yes, exactly. And
Yeah.
that's really such a great point. And it reminded me of, some of the customers we went and visited together, because you brought the ideas, but then you actually went and did put them into a timeline
Yeah.
and kind of showed the customer where that stuff would sit and when
Yeah.
that time to value would be achieved, right? And I think
Yeah.
that was a great way to close out some of those discussions. Like, this is doable, and you could kind of see the relief a little bit. Like, all right, maybe there's a way out of this hole that we've dug ourselves into, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that was a great way to kind of put it in. Not only are you putting your ideas out there, and yeah, you're it's a little bit of vulnerability, I would say, but also kind of saying, here's how you can digest this, and here's how it would work, and here's how we would prioritize this. And now, obviously, depending on the requirements of the business, these can be moved around. But
Right.
I think that visibility that you gave them into what that would look like, and you had all the line items of the things we were bringing to the table, and what
Yeah.
that how they would play out over time. You just kind of you got people doing the head scratch a little bit, like,
Yeah.
maybe this is achievable, right? Maybe we're not going
Yeah.
back to the CFO in 9 months begging for another couple million. Maybe, this is
Yeah.
doable, and instead of, we don't have to eat the elephant in the whole first sitting,
Oh yeah. Yeah.
but we're gonna get there eventually, right? And it doesn't have to be the impossible task. So I think that's a great point.
Yeah, and I really enjoyed that, with customers too, because you could see their eyes light up. They were like, you get to that and they go, yeah. I mean, I literally see people do that, and because what's so interesting to me is, and again, this is where we get back to the complicating and uncomplicating. People think it's very complicated, and again, I mean, we're talking about large scale, services type engagements, which all of this whole approach and philosophy can be applied to any business, really. This is just how we chose to apply it. But what was so interesting was a lot of these customers hadn't actually thought about how to overlay, all of these work streams in a really, really simplified way. And that said, oh, well, this is how they all fit together. Oh, that makes sense. And, and then we kind of go back and iterate and things like that. But I think that was just the easiest way to demonstrate the time to value for, in those particular circumstances. But I would encourage anybody watching this who's looking to just think about that. Is your time to value on anything that you're looking to sell, is it just too long?
Yeah.
And how can you shorten it or show incremental value along the way? Because that's what really will help tremendously. And that's the biggest challenge, is because some of this just looks, to your point, daunting, and you've got this giant elephant and you're going, I don't even know where to begin.
Yeah.
That was the consumable version for clients.
Yeah. So where did you see, I mean, or did you ever see, trouble with this kind of approach, right? Is that, did you run into headwinds with any of the, clients that we were kind of talking to, or things that, you learned from after some time? Like, maybe
Yeah.
won't do that again.
Yes. Yeah. And there's always, I love those experiences because they're always great learning experiences. And the one that I always share was, well, first of all, I didn't really discover this whole approach and sort of the repeatable approach,
Hmm.
and kind of learn this until a couple of years into my time, when I was with AWS. But so early on, it was me sort of doing this, but in a rather haphazard type way, and not necessarily quite as quite as robust. And fortunately, we had some some individuals who kind of started to really materialize this and create at Amazon. There's a lot of repeatable processes that are referred to as mechanisms. So it started to become another mechanism by which you could very easily rinse and repeat something. Um, and then, so it was a learning for me was this whole approach, and it was really just a framework. And what we did is sort of adapt it, and to individuals and things like that in different circumstances. But I had one customer, and one circumstance where I was working with an account manager, and we had a tremendous opportunity for a particular client that we were working with, a very, who was working on a large scale private pricing agreement. And this was a great opportunity to look at how we could incorporate some of the professional services and things like that. And this account manager would not let me go and present this to the customer until it was quote unquote perfect. I always like to say you can take the Amazon, or you can take the girl out of Amazon, but you can't take the Amazon out of the girl, because one of the things that Jeff Bezos always talked about in any of the books that he's written, and talking about creating Amazon, was never wait until you have 100% of the data, because if you do, it's too late.
Yep.
And so even if you go in with 70, 80% accuracy and 80% of the data, you've got enough to make, to formulate a decision. And so I had worked on this and was, presenting this to this account manager. And he said, it's not 100% yet. And I was like, but what's missing? What's missing? What's missing? And so he kept asking me to go back and reiterate and redo, to the point where we finally got in front of the customer. And I kept saying to him, we're getting kind of down to the wire, because they're going to sign this, private pricing agreement. I'd really like professional services to be part of it. And can we, how can we do that? And in the end, I went and presented to the customer, and they went, this is phenomenal. They were like, this is great. This is like, we'd probably change some things and whatever, but they really loved it. The challenge was, they said, gosh, we're just too late. If you'd only come to this, come to us with this a few months back, we could have incorporated it. And I before, after the steam sort of stopped coming out of my ears and things like that, towards the account manager, because the account manager was sitting with me and realized he had been the one who had prevented all of this from happening. And so it was unfortunate. It was a good learning experience for him, but for me, it was, it was a learning experience for me in terms of I should have pushed a little bit harder, but it was a great experience, I think, for him to learn that you don't have to wait till it's perfect. It's never going to be perfect, because you're only going to come in with 80% accuracy. And that goes back to the humility and the nuance of delivery. Like, look, we don't profess to have everything in here 100% right. We just think that there's enough for us to start a conversation. And that's the whole idea. Just start the dialogue with them. So, but that was the biggest challenge I had. I've been fortunate in that I've never really delivered it to a client in such a way that they've not got value out of it. There's been clients who've said, hey, that's great. It's really interesting. It never went anywhere, largely because it wasn't the right time budget wise or things like that. And I'm hoping that in some of those cases they came back to it later, but it really I've never really had a bad experience with it, because you're meeting the customer where they're at, which is so important. And you've got a story for them. And to your point, it can help them look like a hero. I didn't care. Like, whether they came back to me, it'd be great if they hired us to do all of the work that we had listed in it. But if I could help them look like a hero internally, because if they wanted to take it, and oftentimes the customers would say, can I take this and share this internally? And it's like, please, that's where we want to get. We want to get that socialization, want to bring people into the conversation. So, but that was the biggest one, was the waiting for perfection, I think and you touched on the other one, which was the presenting it as your idea, or going way down into the weeds of like product specific, your product, you should do this. No, don't go there.
Yeah, your color scheme is off. Like, you
yes.
should have more magenta.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. For me, it's the thing that I kind of discovered along the way is get out and do it, right? Keep doing it.
Yeah.
And just try to keep improving. I just got better at it each iteration, and I started getting more and more comfortable with the flow of the discussion, and how, and certain, things that I would pick up from the customer and how to go dive into those.
Yeah.
and get them to, to go and expand on the real challenge and what the real problem was. And I just got better and better at that, interaction with clients the more I did it. So, and
Yes.
and it's a hard thing to go do because it does require some prep. You are putting yourself out there, and
Yeah.
it is a little bit nerve wracking. But
Right.
to the point earlier, right? If you want to go after the big deals, if you want to get out of the 20, $30,000 consulting gigs, and you want to
Yep.
get into half a million, $2 million, $5 million deals, in my case, I've done some even bigger deals than that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You got to go to the next level. You got to get your hands dirty a little bit, and you
Yes.
got to really put yourself out there. And the more you do it, the better you get at it, right? Like remembering the
Right.
names. There's all these, I don't have a checklist anymore of all the little tricks that I do, right? I just
Right.
kind of know when I'm going into a customer, these are the things I'm looking for, and then I start to pick up on all the things that kind of trigger me as I go through, like, this is really important. I need to go dive in with this guy a little bit more. I see, the other thing I was always getting good at is like who's feeling the most pain here, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
how do I go latch onto that guy and help him kind of see that there's hope, right? And
Right.
say, hey, your world doesn't have to be like this, right? There's a way out of this.
There's there's what you're touching on is there's a tremendous psychology behind this. Like there, what we're talking about in terms of like there's a repeatable process, sure, but it's all it is a framework for making it easier for yourself. And but it all comes down to human psychology, really. And so it's and we've talked about this, you and I, before, about the idea of shifting from a vendor or a salesperson or an account manager to becoming a trusted advisor. And that takes time. And what you and I are talking about specifically in the services industry and those larger deals, there's a long runway. They don't happen overnight, and you can go and you can sell a $50,000 service in a fairly short time frame. That may be how the trust starts, in terms of some of those smaller opportunities, in being able to position your brand, your company, your business, your delivery team, all of that, even just in by way of helping your clients understand this is how we think, this is how we do things. And again, going back to that time to value, some of those smaller engagements can be really tremendous trust builders, and the opportunity to start really establishing yourself with new customers that you have. But when you think about everything we're talking about, comes back to just it's human nature, it's human psychology, it's understanding how and being able to make those connections with people. And I've got all of I've been reading a lot about this in the last few years, and I've got a whole list of books and recommended reading on my website, just because I've been so influenced and sort of started to pull little nuggets from books like Grit by Angela Duckworth. There's even stuff about that. Will It Make the Boat Go Faster is another great book on like how you focus efforts and things like that. But The Trusted Advisor, is a tremendous book. And when you read that and start to understand and think about that, I started reading that long after I started this process, and I went, all it did was validate a lot of it, which was great. And I said, oh, that's great. And I kind of took a few little nuggets. But then there's the other one too, which is, and I think we haven't touched on this, but would be interesting too, is unreasonable hospitality.
Hmm.
What are you doing to differentiate yourself and to give your customers to surprise and delight? And I know that's an overused phrase, but that's a really important aspect of it too. So how are you making that connection in a very unusual way that maybe somebody else, one of your competitors, isn't? So,
Yeah.
because that's a piece too.
Going above and beyond. I think
Yes.
that's a key part of it, right? And
Right.
even in my current business, it's something that we do a lot of. And I was reading one guy, or it was a YouTube video, and one of the really popular guys, not Gary Vee, but there's another guy out there, and it was all about the concept of value in advance, right?
Yes.
And giving customers a taste of what your business might be like, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
kind of throwing some stuff at them. They made, it happened once at Software One. We had a customer who, like someone had left the organization. They had a bunch of apps that were tied to his ID. They weren't technical at all, so they're like the whole business is about to shut down, right? We're desperate,
Yeah. Yeah.
and they didn't really have a lot of money, so it was like, and it was like, we didn't have time to go through 2 weeks of contract negotiation and getting them
Right. Right.
onboarding and all that. So we
Yeah.
went and gave them an architect for 2 hours. He kind of figured out their whole Active Directory structure,
Right.
and figured out where the ID was. Told them how to set up generic IDs so that they don't have that problem in the future. And 2 weeks later, they ended up signing a $50,000 deal with us, right? So
Right.
it
Right.
was just, by giving that little bit of value up front, we number one, developed a rapport with them. Number two, it was a word that we haven't thrown out there much yet in this conversation, but it was empathy, right? So
Yes. Yeah.
so we kind of, I felt their pain. I was just sitting there like, oh my God, you poor people. Like, I'm literally, you can't, the applications aren't available to their customers anymore. They've been down for 2 days. They've been calling the guy trying to get him to come back in, but they already deleted his ID. So they
Right.
have like, this broken sync someplace between, the applications and Active Directory. So we came in, got it figured out for them. And, we were heroes, right? So,
Yep.
and they were like, yes, you guys did the right thing by us, we're going to do the right thing by you. And it ended up going to be a big deal. But that word empathy just kind of popped up there to me. It's like, that's, the other thing, when you walk into that room and you start seeing where the pain points are, you have to show that you have some level of caring involved.
I completely agree, and I'm so glad you raised that because, it triggered a few memories. I had a similar experience like you had, where we had a customer when I was at AWS, and there was something that they needed, and I can't remember exactly what it was, but so the account manager came and said, "Oh, they need help doing this," and I went and I brought somebody in, one of our consultants, and they said, actually, we're just about to release an open source solution for that. We're just going to put out there, in GitHub somewhere. And I was like, and they said, we're just waiting for some, like, our legal to approve it, like, just from a risk perspective, and because there was an internal process for doing that. And so I said to the customer, I said, I can't in good conscience, like, charge you. Like, I said, if you want, we can bring a consultant in to do this for you. But like, I have to charge you for that. But if you can wait a few weeks until our legal signs off, we're putting it out there for everybody. So, do you want to? And they really appreciated that, the fact that I was willing to just kind of, say, like, don't do that. Like, if you can wait, and if it's mission critical, then, we'll see what we can do. And, so, but the other thing that you mentioned was on the empathy side of it. And you talked a little bit about it, in that connection with Rajesh, when you were using the example of, like, that's the empathy and the storytelling, right? You're empathizing with that. And one of the things that this was my personal benefit, of having been a leader of a team of cloud platform engineers in my time at Whole Foods Market, where I was leading this team of, in digital technology, was I had been where the Rajeshes of the world were. I'd had like 48, 50-hour outages, all that sort of stuff. I mean, it was horrible. And so when I went in, it kind of ties into credibility as well. When I went in and I introduced myself, in my time, and still to this day, I would tell people, "Hey, I led a team of cloud platform engineers at, Whole Foods Market," because it's instant credibility, and it suggests that I'm going to understand exactly what it is that they're experiencing and some of those pain points. And so some of that is really just, making sure that you can connect on that personal level and that background level. And, because I wasn't coming in as a quote unquote salesperson. I was coming in as somebody who sat in their shoes. And so, the idea of being able to kind of talk to them at the level about, okay, here's the challenges you're having. And I raise that only because one of the challenges that I had in hiring people when I was building my team, at AWS, was finding resources. You can find salespeople, and sometimes it's harder to get salespeople to truly understand how to connect with the client and build that story and things like that if they haven't been there, than it is to find somebody who's been there and done that and train them how to sell.
Yeah.
And so it's making sure when you're hiring and you're finding resources, you're finding the right resources, because you can find somebody who can, remember, like I referred back to the, I'm going to use Bob's name 10 times in a conversation. Although in that conversation, that's the only value I've added. Is Bob knows I remember his name, but I haven't been able to connect with Bob. So
Yeah.
it's finding that balance of, and I often went looking for, they would tell me, oh, we've got this person from, this SI or this person from this SI. And I said, find me somebody who's been a customer. Because if you've been a customer in this space, you have that empathy and you really understand that. And so it's not to say that other salespeople can't. I'm not saying that at all. But it's a challenge in being able to find people who can truly understand what those customers are doing and that level of complexity if you haven't sat in their shoes. So it's just an interesting point that you raised on the empathy. So I'm glad you raised that.
No, and it's, we're getting towards the end of time here, so we'll kind of
Yeah.
close it out with that, I think. And it's, one of my favorite LinkedIn guys is Brian Burns, and one of his whole things is, to be a great salesperson, you don't be a salesperson, right?
Yes. Don't tell.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, to
And
be able to
that's,
walk in and say, I'm not a salesperson, right?
yeah.
I'm just here to help figure out what your problems are and see if there's a
Yeah.
way that there's a solution out there, right? Whether it's
Yeah.
me or, we point you somewhere else, I'm really just
Yeah.
here to help.
Yeah. And that's exactly why I love the idea of, and I totally agree. And when you go in with the idea of doing the research on the customer, coming to them with ideas, you're building that rapport as a trusted advisor, and you're no longer a salesperson. You're coming to them with value, and they haven't even spent a penny, and you're already delivering value just through ideas. And getting them thinking more about, oh, here's the impact that Bob and he can have on my business and what he's presenting, and so I love that. Yeah, I that's why I say, people always say, oh, you always sold and you sold so well. I said, I never sold. That's the whole idea. I don't ever feel like I sold anything. I just sat there and I solutioned with my customers. And then we would have a discussion around the commercial, cost of what the solution was going to be.
Yep.
So, anyway, but it's a fascinating topic. It's a fascinating industry, but I'm so glad we had the chance to connect today on this, Bob. Thank you.
Yeah, it was really good. I hope everyone gets some value out of this. It's been a great conversation, as always. Every time we get together, I
Yeah,
always learn something, and then I always enjoy the time. So thank you very much for
me too.
joining
Thank
today,
you.
and I look forward to the next time because I'm sure we're going to get a lot of interest in all the topics we talked about, and maybe someone will push us to go and do a different topic some other day on
I would
something
love
else
to.
in sales. All right.
Sounds great.
All
Thanks,
right. Thanks,
Bob.
Darlene.
Appreciate it. All right. Take care.